This is your third lecture for our Introduction to Philosophy, and in this lecture we'll be looking at the philosophers that predate Socrates.
In a very basic sense, what these very first Western philosophers were doing was thinking about thinking. Why do we think the way that we think? What process is our mind going through and coming up with our convictions or beliefs about what we think is real or actual? This was actually seen as a waste of time or a foolish enterprise by many because oftentimes these earliest philosophers would make arguments that were logical. I mean, the dots connected and what their thought process was, but the truth that they would arrive at was completely contradictory to sensory experience with what you could see with your eyes or hear with your ears. Now, many of these earliest philosophies of the Greek culture emerged because the people were steeped in ethnocentricity. One thing that your author did not point out is that each Greek city had a particular identity of what made them superior to other cities. Within Athens, it was the intellectual world, and that's why philosophy would stem from Athens. Another example would be Sparta. Sparta was known for its warriors, its military. There was another city called Corinth, and it was known for their parties and their orgies, and were known as pretty much a morally corrupt city, but they took some pride in that. So each city had its particular niche or niche that made it special or unique. And so within, again, Athens, it was the intellectual world, and so we have philosophy coming from that. These very first philosophers were called Sophists. They appeared strange to the majority of their culture because others would still base what they considered truth or reality upon the stories that came from a religion or a particular mythology. And the Sophists were dismissing religion and mythology, or at least making it secondary, and they were saying that humanity should be the center, and by humanity they mean the way that humanity would think and arrive at truth through logic. One example of an early Sophist is pictured here. This is Thales. And we also need to realize another fact that your author did not bring up in the textbook is that the Sophists were known for the peripateo method of teaching, and this means that they would walk around the streets during the day and they would build disciples or students who would follow them as they're walking. The entire time that the Sophist is walking, he is also teaching what he considers truth. Also, these students and disciples were not charged any financial compensation for the teaching. That was considered to be corrupt, that if you were to take money for telling others the truth, then it really couldn't be the truth, because why would you profit from that? The truth should be enough in and of itself. One of the earliest debates among these pre-Socratic philosophers, or the Sophists, addressed whether change and movement really happened, if that was actual, or if it was actually just an illusion. One who argued that change and movement is constantly taking place is Heraclitus, and Heraclitus is pictured here. He argued that there is constant movement throughout the universe, and he also became one who contrasted the cosmos, which means looking outward and seeing the observable universe, with the psyche, which is the inward turn to the human mind. Please remember that in the very first lecture I made a point that this is a division that we see throughout philosophy, or a differentiation, better than division. A differentiation that we see throughout the history of philosophy is that some are more drawn to looking to the outside with what they can observe with their senses, and some are more drawn to looking inside. And so again, Heraclitus is differentiating between the cosmos and the psyche. He says, as much as these two differ from one another, however, they're both under the domain of the logos. And logos is a very important concept that you understand from this Greek culture in this era. Literally translated, it means the word. If any of you come, well, I'm sure some of you do come from a Christian tradition, within your New Testament you have a book called John, and John describes the Logos becoming flesh, becoming a person in Jesus of Nazareth. And so this idea is the Word becomes flesh. And so the word for the Greek culture means this sort of divine but impersonal force or process that orders or puts all things together. And so again, from the Christian tradition, realize how bizarre a statement that would have seemed initially to those first reading it or hearing it, that this impersonal divine force becomes a person. It seems like quite a paradox. But Heraclitus also used the word in the impersonal sense, that it is this force that brings all things or orders all things. Those who disagreed with Heraclitus, a fine example would be Parmenides and later his student Zeno. They countered this claim by saying that although it appears that things are changing and moving all the time, that this is actually just an illusion, that it's not really happening. And you see in your textbook that Zeno has a few interesting arguments to make to support this idea. We have also with Parmenides and Zeno the movement transition from cosmology to ontology. And if you go back to your very first lecture, you'll see that ontology is one of the major characteristics of philosophy, in which we question what actually is, what is being, what is existing. This is the move from physics, what you can observe in scientific experimentation, to metaphysics, that which is beyond physics. To support the ideas that Parmenides was presenting, we have Leucippus and Democritus, and they brought up a theory called atomism, and this was to support the idea that things only appear to be moving, but they're not really moving. That the only thing that actually exists are atoms, these very, very small particles that you cannot see with the naked eye. They are indivisible, and what these atoms do is they clump together to form things that appear to be moving and changing, but in fact the atoms never change, and they're the only thing that really is. These small particles never change. And so the only thing that exists is the atoms, and of course the void or the space between the atoms, according to Leucippus and Democritus. They also use this idea of atomism to bring about the idea of nature and convention, that the only thing that is actually nature that exists are the atoms and of course the space between them, and all the other things that we think are real are actually just conventions that come from the atoms clumping together. So any sort of sense experience like taste or smell, we think these things are real, but they're actually just conventions that come from the atoms joining together to form a person or an animal or whatever else these atoms might form. Eventually, these cities within Greek culture begin to interact with one another, and this is when we return to this concept of ethnocentricity, of thinking that you have to find some way to prove that your city or your people is superior to all others. Well, of course, it becomes obvious that the philosophers, the Sophists, are the ones that are standing out in Athens, even though they had been challenged by many for appearing foolish. This now changes with the ethnocentric challenge. And our big transition takes place as we move from the Sophos to Sophist or sophistry. And the major transition here is that now the philosophers become highly respected members and very powerful members of their society, and also they do receive payment for their teachings. And so within Athens, philosophical knowledge became viewed as a very valuable power, especially if you were gifted in rhetoric, and that is using your words to be able to explain what your ideas are. Philosophers who could communicate their ideas with the most charisma and persuasiveness, in a sense, became celebrities in the culture. If you would have had TMZ back 2,500 years ago in the Greek Empire, you would have had the paparazzi following around philosophers. A fine example of a sophist is Protagoras, who is pictured on this slide. He argued a conviction of relativism, and this means, for Protagoras, a little different than what you may think of when you think of something being relative, but Protagoras would make the argument that whatever you think is true or actual is based solely upon your experiences and your background. And so the more experienced you are, the more you have traveled, the more insight that you have into things such as morality and ethics. And Protagoras had traveled quite a bit, and so he became highly respected as one who had many experiences and would have insight into morality. Um, Protagoras would argue, because of this relativism, that there's no need to make judgments about something being universally right or wrong because we are so limited by our experiences and background. And so he argued that it would be a waste of time to sit around and simply theorize about morality, but instead we need to look at the results that come from moral decisions that are made, and we can judge by the result of what has happened whether the action had good moral consequences or not. A very important term here, this would be referred to as moral pragmatism. Pragmatism coming from pragma, pragmatic, and this means what actually works, what actually comes about because of the deed that was performed. And so rather than using theoretical knowledge, Protagoras moved toward pragmatic knowledge of observing, looking at what a deed or a particular work actually accomplished. Now, this moral relativism would go one step further in another generation. We have Sophists such as Heraclitus, who would move into a realm that we call moral realism. And this is the belief that power is the greatest good. And so if you have power to be able to dominate others and take control of others, that is your right. And because you have the power, that makes you right. And so this is a very different idea than what most of us probably think of as being morally right or wrong today. That if you have the power to do something, that means that you have the right to do it. It makes you right simply because you have power. And I hope you do see how that is definitely a step further from what Protagoras was arguing with moral relativism. And again, this teaching of Heraclitus is called moral realism.